Thank you so much. As you heard, this talk is called Florida Hustlers, Blue Bloods, and Dreamers, The Rise of the Florida Mafia. And first of all, I want to thank so much, again, Tropic Cinema. We came here last night and we saw North by Northwest, which was fantastic. This is a great theater to see classic cinema in, right? I also want to thank Emily and Books and Books for having me and my work at the store. They have my memoir. They did last year anyway, and now they have this book. I stopped by the store when we got in on Sunday, and I don't know if you know, but they have a cutout of Judy Blume in the window. And I went up to it to sort of be like, hey, look, I'm going to take a picture with Judy Blume. And I'm standing there like this, and my husband's trying to get the shot. And this guy says, he comes up behind me. He's like, you know, if you go inside, they'll turn it around. And I turn and I look. Judy Blume was standing there with her husband. And my husband caught that moment of me going like, oh, like it's Judy Blume. Oh, my God. My 13-year-old self died, and it's fine. And I also want to thank Corey Convertito, because this book was born in research. And the reason I love research, and I loved researching all the characters of this series that I have decided to call the QUEENPIN Chronicles. When I started, it was just going to be a standalone novel called Florida Girls. But the more looking into the stories that I did behind this rich culture that we have here in this state, the more that I found that I wanted to explore, especially during World War II, because things changed dramatically for women at that time. Men went off to war, women were left behind, and they really had to do whatever it took to make do. And then when the men started coming back home, not all the women were that excited to just sort of be like, okay, you're back. Everything's fine now. And, I started writing this during the pandemic, and I felt emotional resonance with these characters because, the vaccine is coming. We're coming out of lockdown. I want it, but I don't want it. What to do? And that sort of kind of anxiety that went on and on and on. And the end of World War II was like that. I mean, World War II ended in Europe in May. It wasn't over for us until August, because that's when things ended in the Pacific with the dropping, or actually, did I say August? Yes, August, when the A-bomb was dropped. So again, it was just this months-long ending. And of course, not everybody came home all at once. So anyway, we have women at home. But what is it that someone like me, sort of a self-professed like Judy Blume fan, is doing writing about the mafia? Well, again, I'm a journalist, and I became intrigued by these stories and this research, but also a very personal connection, not only because I moved to Florida in 2016 from New York City, but because when I moved here, I heard about this fellow right here. This is John Lodwick. Now I'm going to move because that gets very bright. Does anybody in here, have you heard of John Lodwick? The nice thing is I can see everybody because it's so bright. John Lodwick was a promotional mastermind. He moved here from Cleveland in 1918, probably for the same reason a lot of us moved here, because he hated the cold weather. And he gets here, and he loves it so much, he starts sending out photographs of snowbirds sort of cavorting around, enjoying winter sports like shuffleboard, to the newspapers. And this campaign is so successful at attracting tourists that St. Petersburg hired him to be their publicist. But he sort of turned things up a notch real quick. This is Sally Rand. Now, he hired Sally Rand. I don't know if you know, does anyone know who Sally Rand is? Oh, nice. Well, this is a saucy crowd. Because Sally Rand was sort of the original fan dancer. So he hired her to frolic nude on the beach in St. Petersburg. And here she is doing just that. And you can see she's not really nude. She's wearing a flesh-colored bathing suit. But the thing that's interesting about that to me is she was doing it to promote nude sunbathing. Nude in 1930, St. Petersburg opened a municipal solarium. And that solarium, here's a great picture of that. That solarium, it was Egypt themed, which I find so interesting. But anyway, it ran from 1930 to 1960, right in downtown St. Pete. But there were nude beaches all over the place. Basically, they were these two-story structures where people would lie, up a story, and they would lie in there all together. But John Lodwick's contribution to this plan, and it molded what became sort of common public relations practice, which I don't know if I mentioned, but I worked in PR for many, many years. John Lodwick commissioned a study on the curative properties of heliotherapy. Heliotherapy being, of course, nude sunbathing, but it sounds better to write it on a prescription pad. And you could actually get a prescription for heliotherapy, which would necessitate, of course, a visit to Florida beaches, especially where they have nude sunbathing. So this was the kind of promotional campaign he did, very famous. He commissioned that study in 1922. This didn't open until 1930. This is another campaign that he unleashed, right, in 1922. This is actually a full-page Sunday spread in the Sunday San Francisco Examiner. Now, for those of you who, like me, are old enough to remember newspapers, Sunday was the big, thick one. I mean, that was, and somebody who worked in PR, that was like, wow, you get into a Sunday paper. That's really the gold standard. This Purity League was entirely an invention of John Lodwick's. There was no group of outraged women who were horrified and demanding a bathing suit inspector, right? Yet he had these editorials appearing. They weren't all quite this much. He had these editorials appearing in newspapers across the country. And in fact, Florida Girls opens almost word for word with what was printed in the New York Times. Anyway, so I just want to read this one little quote in this piece, and I'm going to show you, in case you don't believe me, that this was a full-page spread. But anyway, they quote a young woman in here, and she says, and I love how contemporary those women look, right? She says, "Nowadays, we do real hard athletic work in our water sports. Grandmother used to cover herself up from her toes to her chin and walk down and step timidly into the water and splash around for a while and then go out and call it sea bathing. Now things have changed. We go in for real athletic sports. We swim, dive, play water polo, and all sorts of stunts. And it can't be done with skirts and pantaloons." That is what the women of the league don't seem to grasp. And what I love about that quote is that, the more things change, the more they stay the same. It's sort of 'twas ever thus, right? Like, it feels like if you have children, maybe they said the same thing to you. You just don't get it. Now, something else you may notice here, right there, is Mayor Frank F. Pulver. He is described right here as the young bachelor mayor of St. Petersburg. I'd like to take you to Exhibit A. He's 52 years old in this photo, and I'd just like to say I wish they would bring this back, describing 52-year-olds as young. Like, we need that again, right? Thank you. Anyway, so this is going on, but fun and frolicking on the beach, as John Lodwick was promoting, was not the only thing that was affecting tourism in Florida. Prohibition was also the law of the land. Remember these fun times? From 1922 to 1930, alcohol was not allowed to be sold, and as we all know, didn't work at all, but nowhere more so than in Florida. And here's another quote, and I promise you I don't read a ton of quotes throughout this. These two just happen to be right on top of each other. This one really shocked me. It's out of the Miami Herald, and it says that Florida snubbed prohibition to a greater degree than any other part of the country, saying that the days of prohibition were the most protracted and pervasive period of lawlessness and debauchery in the region's history. That was written in 2008. Now think about it. Like, they had a lot of time between 1920 and 2008 to like pick lawlessness and debauchery. I mean, coke-fueled 1980s, anyone? But no, they went with Prohibition times in Florida specifically. And as we all know, Prohibition was not the end of vice, but the rise of opportunity. And the Mafia crushed it. You all recognize these fellows, right? We have here Al Capone and Meyer Lansky. Now, these are some of the most famous mafia figures in the land. And they were active in Florida, but they weren't a huge factor in Florida. So Al Capone, for instance, most notorious gangster of the 20s and very famous as an untouchable fighting Elliot Ness. There's a movie, in fact, coming here. They're going to be showing The Untouchables. Go see it. Anyway, he actually did something that no one has done before or since. In 1928, he bought a Spanish-style mansion in Palm Island near Miami for, I think, $40,000. And he came here to rehab his image. Nobody moves to Florida to rehab their image. But he did, because he had to get out of Chicago when the heat was on. So when things were going down in Chicago, he would come to Florida and hide out. So, for instance, during the St. Valentine's Day massacre, when it was one of the most deadly executions in Mafia history, 7 gangsters were just gunned down execution style against a wall in Chicago. Conveniently, Al Capone was in Florida at a party with local officials who could vouch for his whereabouts. But, as we all know, it did not work out for him, because in 1931, the IRS caught up with him. Now, he was indicted on some charges of, flouting prohibition laws, but the IRS is really the agency that took him down. They got him in jail in 1931, but then after that, he was no longer a factor, because by the time he was released in 1939, his brain was so addled from syphilis, he just really couldn't do anything, and he did retire in Florida, but not as a powerful figure. Meyer Lansky, on the other hand, very different. He purchased down here in 1930, and he began setting up illegal casinos, otherwise known as carpet joints. Now, these casinos were as lavish as any you might find in Las Vegas, but still totally illegal. Nonetheless, his main focus was on Cuba. Miami is where he was located, and Cuba's just 90 miles off the coast there. And so he started pumping millions and millions into Batista's coffers. Now, this turned out to be not a long play, because in 1959, of course, Castro came, the Cuban Revolution, everything. He lost everything there. Lansky ended up putting his money into the Bahamas and the Caribbean. Not really much of a factor in Florida at all. The players in Florida were from Florida. So we have here the blue-blooded orphan Charlie Wall, I think you can tell. And then over here we have Ignacio Antinori. And these were the real power brokers in Florida's mafia scene when it first began. And the rise of the Florida Mafia, and the reason that these two had such a stranglehold on it, owes in no small part to this game. Does anybody recognize what these are? Very close. These are actually bolita balls. Now, bolita is a game that was brought over by Cubans in the 1880s. It is the precursor to the modern lottery, actually. I can go back. If you see that? It's a numbers game. They put balls into a bag numbered 1 to 100. It was so easy to rig. You could freeze one, you could hollow it out, you could put a little lead weight on it, and then they picked it, or texture it, whatever, and they would pick certain numbers on purpose. You could get in for pennies, out for pounds, right? That was the lure of bolita. When it was brought over by the Cubans, it grew and grew in popularity until the Mafia said, hey, wait a minute, there's a lot of money in this game, notably Charlie Wall, and they decided that they were going to take it over. So they took it over, but then they started fighting with each other, and Charlie Wall and Ignacio Antinori went head to head from the 30s until 1940. That was called the Era of Blood. Let me just say a couple more things about bolita. It was so wildly popular in Ybor City. That's where there's a large Cuban population in Tampa, and there are a lot of cigar factories there. And on payday, they would have 3 tables out in front of the cigar factories. One was the pay man, the other was the union man, and then the other was the bolita man. And they would give and take accordingly, right? But this game was a huge moneymaker. At one of Charlie Wall's betting parlors, it's a USF report said that he was bringing in some most nights $57,000 a night, and that is not adjusted for today's money. That's how much he was bringing in the 30s. I mean, just imagine, that's just at one place. There were bolita joints from, again, they had carpet joints. You could bet at a grocery store. You could bet in an alley. Like, it was just everywhere. And, that sort of fed part of what became the basis of the story in Florida Girls. But when the Mafia got involved and they began what was known as the Era of Blood, that decade saw 40 gangsters shot in the streets over control of this game. And I mean, it was a bloodthirsty time with Ignacio and Charlie Wall battling it out. And ultimately, it ended because Ignacio was shot and killed in 1940, but not over bolita. He was killed because one of the things about Charlie Wall, he was a Sicilian immigrant who, we don't know much about his early life, but he was much more into the heroin trafficking. And he was the largest, by the 30s, he was one of the largest heroin traffickers in the country. And he had shipped a bad shipment of product out to St. Louis, and the Chicago outfit killed him for it. And that left one man standing, and it was Charlie Wall. Charlie Wall, some call him the dean of the Tampa underworld. Honestly, I don't even know what that means. He also had the nickname of the White Shadow. And he was very involved in local politics. But the interesting thing about Charlie Wall is he came from a political family. So his grandfather had been mayor. His father was mayor. But when his mother died, when he was about 13, and his father remarried, he became a wild child. Reports are that he tried to shoot maybe the cook, maybe his stepmother. Whoever he shot at, he ended up in military school. And after he spent some time in military school, that's where he really learned how to be a crook. And he spent a lot of time playing bolita in the streets. This was before it was a mafia thing. He was part of making it part of the mafia. And when he was finished, after he took control of the bolita games, he ended up at the end of the Era of Blood. I call it the bolita wars in my book. Sometimes it's a little tricky because I thinking about the book, and that, because I had to fictionalize things to suit the plot. Anyway, at the end of the Era of Blood, he was the one standing. And the thing that was so incredible about that was that was when the Traficantes came along. Now, how many of you have heard of the Traficantes? Yes. So right here, we have a lot of unknown men. We don't really know who's in this picture, except for 2 people in particular. Right there is Santo Traficante Sr. with a little tie in the back. And does anybody recognize this guy? It's Ignacio Antinori. Santo was Ignacio's protege, and Antinori brought him on board in order to get the more power in Bolita, because Bolita, again, was a huge factor in the power here in Florida. And when he was shot, Santo was not happy about that. And he somehow went to Charlie Wall after this decade, otherwise known as the Era of Blood, and persuaded him in person to step aside, which he did, which is stunning if you think about it. Like, how terrifying must Santo Trafficante have been to get Charlie Wall to step aside? Charlie Wall, the White Shadow. I don't believe it's because he was a benevolent crook, by the way. So there's some, disagreement about where that nickname came from. Was it because he wore white suits and a bowler hat, or was it because he was active in local politics? And I don't know what it's supposed to mean. Anyway, I don't think he was a good guy. But when the thing that happens next is kind of a whole lot of nothing. So the mafia is getting firmly entrenched, but the government is now fighting World War II. So they don't have really the manpower to be fighting with the mafia until about 1950. So does anybody remember the Kefauver hearings? Anyone? Yes, I see some nodding. So in 1950 and 1951, Senator Estes Kefauver conducted a series of hearings across the country that put organized crime on trial live on national television. So for those of you who don't remember, this was probably on more than one of the 3 channels and probably broadcast all day long. So everybody was glued to what was going on. It was absolutely must-see TV because it was only CTV. So Charlie Wall, he gets up, they get him to testify before the committee. And he babbles like a brook. He clearly is reveling in telling the stories of the old days. I mean, kind of to the detriment of the trial. The whole thing became more of an entertainment spectacle than a legal proceeding. And ultimately, Charlie Wall continued working with the federal government. And it's been speculated, although the murder has never been proven, that it was eventually his working with the government that put Santo Trafficante Jr. in jail for a short time. I mean, the Trafficantes ended up being the main force in Florida Mafia up through 1987 when Jr. died. But when he died in 1955, his body was found, he was sort of clubbed to death outside his house, and he was found sprinkled with birdseed. So it feels kind of, on the nose for a Mafia-style hit. But anyway, so that was the end of Charlie Wall, and really that was the period from which the Trafficantes just reigned. And I don't know if you remember the movie Donnie Brasco. It was based on a book by an FBI undercover agent named Joseph Pistone, and he said very definitively that in Florida, nothing happened without the Trafficantes. So that was they were a big factor for a very long time. And another factor is this woman here. This is Virginia Hill. Does anybody know Virginia Hill? Little, some. So it's always interesting to me who's like familiar to people and who is not. Virginia Hill was Bugsy Siegel's, known widely as Bugsy Siegel's girlfriend, but she entertained lots of gentlemen callers. And during the Kefauver hearings, she was quite the character. I think of her as sort of the Stormy Daniels of her time. The difference being she didn't really give anybody up. However, what she did do was, again, this was live on national television. She said things like, I don't know nothing, I don't know nothing about nothing. That was I thought that was a good one. But she also, they said, now the senator was saying, now why would these men give you all this money? And she's like, do you really want to know? You can actually watch the video. They still have it in archives if you go into Google and do deep research. And he's like, well, yes, I do. And she's like, because I'm the best damn bleep sucker in town. Live on national TV. And again, I mentioned this. I said bleep. People say that this is what led to the delay in broadcast television. And I also work in broadcast television. So again, I'm feeling this affinity for these characters, right? And then, of course, when it comes to working with the US government, no one more famously so really than Lucky Luciano. And it was very interesting to me to discover how much these gangsters over the years, and this was not just in Tampa, this was in New York, obviously, and in Las Vegas, they worked with the federal government. It was like they were all double agents. Imagine that. Can't trust a crook. Anyway, Lucky Luciano, he's also in jail on tax evasion charges when World War II breaks out. Now, in 1941, the government was very worried about the security of the New York City ports because the New York City ports were controlled by Italians. The Italians in the New York City ports were controlled by Lucky Luciano. And in 1941, the Italians were still, that's right, with the Axis. So the support or the security of the ports were not guaranteed. So they went, and one more factor, one of the people who had prosecuted him, Thomas Dewey, on charges of prostitution, many of which were trumped up. They would get these women addicted to drugs and then coerce them into giving testimony that was the testimony they wanted them to give. I'm not trying to absolve Lucky Luciano from crimes, but the way that he was prosecuted was not good. Anyway, he is in jail, and it's Thomas Dewey's people who are now working in intelligence and trying to get him to cooperate. So ultimately, the government said, okay, you can have unmonitored visits with your associates for as long as you're in here. The government, of course, said, well, we didn't give him anything, but they did end up getting the support, his support in the ports. Meanwhile, Lucky ended up running his business unfettered from jail, and then he got out. But there were plenty of instances that this mattered a lot. One of them was called Operation Underworld, and in Operation Underworld, the government worked with informants in the mob to get information about what was happening in Sicily to win an important battle there. And now the name of it is escaping me. But in their first instance of working with them, they were trying to intercept something called Operation Pistorius. Has anybody heard of that? Yes, some yes. So Operation Pistorius was a German operation, and it was a group of men were going to come over in U-boats, armed with explosives, to infiltrate the U.S. borders and then disable civilian waterways, roadways, and just create general havoc. And they actually made it ashore. And when they made it to shore, the reason that they got caught is because the leader of this operation had secretly harbored a desire to be an American citizen, like all of his life. So he immediately went to somebody and said, hey, guess what? We're here as part of a German operation. We're going to infiltrate your borders. And they were like, okay, let me just talk to some people about that. And he thought, I'm such a good Samaritan. They're going to reward me with citizenship, and life will be great. But this is what happened. These are the proceedings where they're putting the people from Operation Pistorius on trial. And, these kinds of operations, Germans came way far down along the coast. There were reported sightings throughout World War II. There were German soldiers who were caught on shore with movie tickets in their pockets. But then there have also been books written by ex-military about who, on the German side, shooting at boats from the water from their U-boats because nobody suspected that they would be there. So the government would really take, if they got wind of a threat, they tried to take it really seriously. That plays into this book that I wrote, Florida Girls. And again, back to this book, as implausible as it may seem that it was born in research, here is the other thing that informed the book. It was me coming across this photograph. Now, you look at these women and you see very clearly they are dressed in 1940. They have 1940s style hair with the kind of, those are very 40s style hairdos, 40s style bathing suits. And I was like, wait, weren't we at war during World War II? Or during the 40s? So I just want to read you another quote from this because it's too good not to read. And this is what really sparked my attention in bringing all of these topics together. Because I wanted to create a world that brought together lots of different classes of people. And this quote was sort of the key. So this is from the caption that you can't really read there, but it's on the screen. And it says, in the course of their 4-day revel, the poster girls also participated in a swimming contest at which none swam because none was good enough. A milkshake party at which they ate banana splits, I cannot make this up, and a screen test from which all returned to Florida. All this was, of course, a big publicity stunt for the poster girls. A busty contingent of teenagers hired by J.E. Doc Webb of St. Petersburg to model the latest fashions at his drugstore. The 8 girls were selected from some 300 he trains as models in order, he says, to lessen juvenile delinquency. So these girls, they toured, this troupe of showgirls toured from the 30s to the 60s. Here's another. I've got some great photos of them. I love this one. This is them boarding, because everybody gets on a bus in, bathing suits and high heels. Come on, ladies, let's go. So Webb City Drug billed itself as the world's most unusual drugstore. In my book, it becomes Sun City Emporium, which is also billed as the world's most unusual drugstore. And it was an interesting place. I mean, they had hosiery dancing. You could get a haircut. You could buy onions. You could see a dancing chicken show, see a mermaid show. Like, it was all out. It was sort of the precursor to, think, Walmart with live entertainment, right? Very anything goes. And the prices were not to be beaten. There was a discount store for sure. Now, I fear this may do that thing where it's going beep, 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 which, let's see, yes. So again, I saw that photograph. I had this knowledge in my mind about John Lodwick, right? And I see this photo of these poster girls, and I think, not like, oh, how sweet. My first thought was like, what kind of hustler made that happen? Because during World War II, rationing was in effect. They had, posters against tourism. If you didn't have gas or tires in your car, you put it up on blocks and you walked. Like, you did not, there was no sort of way around it. So how is this kind of, let's face it, like a discount drugstore getting its girls to go out and travel like this? That's where the Mafia came in, because I got to imagine they had a bolita window there. But, I'm not saying for sure, because when I sort of realized what I wanted to do, I didn't keep researching. So the poster girls are based on sort of memoirs and some women that I'll talk about at the end here. But I also talk about them a lot in my blog, Ill-Behaved Women. Anyway, so we ration sugar, coffee, meat, butter. Sad days. I mean, geez. Tires and gasoline. So how were they traveling? Now, come on. What are they doing right here? they're at a launch of a new fleet of garbage trucks. What industry runs garbage collection? Right. What are the poster girls doing there? So again, all signs seem to point to that. And of course, I had to include this scene in the book where they are launching this fleet of garbage trucks, because my poster girls are made up of a mix of sort of, rough and ready to high society girls. And some of them are just really horrified. And others immediately recognize what is going on. So here we are again. When I decided to write this book, I had to find people who could be mentors, because what does a hero need? They need mentors. So I have a Virginia Hill come in. I love this photograph because here she is shown with unnamed arm candy. Like usually it's the opposite. It's sort of like this gentleman and then these ladies. But here, the caption actually read Virginia Hill and two gentlemen or something like that. And then this next woman, she was a fearsome queenpin in her own right. This is Stephanie St. Clair. Has any of you ever heard of her? No? She, a black woman, emigrated to the U.S. from the West Indies in 1918 or so. And she immediately sort of looked around and realized, like, okay, as a black woman in the United States, there's two ways to make money. I'm going with selling drugs. And she actually very quickly had her own, she was hiring people to distribute for her. She had protection. She had a whole selling drugs and numbers. She ran a numbers racket. I don't know why I said selling drugs. That just came out of my mouth. What's on my mind here in Key West? But she did some of that as well, but her main thing was the numbers racket. And what's remarkable about Stephanie St. Clair was that she ran a numbers racket that rivaled the Mafias, and she fought them off her turf for decades. And when she did escape the life, I mean, it was after a bloody duel with this guy, Charles Schultz, who ended up dead. She actually left with her fortunes intact. And she ended up sort of going into a sort of retirement, living in this grand mansion and kind of retiring from public life. And that was her. But when she was in her prime, she dressed lavishly in jewels and furs. She took out ads complaining about the police treatment of black people in Harlem. And she even took out ads against suitors that annoyed her. She was quite a character. So, of course, she had to make an appearance in Florida Girls. By that time, she was retired. So she just gave some advice to, well, she sets something up, I'll say. And then this last woman, Miss Maxine Lewis. Now, she's fascinating to me because she was in vaudeville from a young age. She became a producer in Las Vegas at every mafia-controlled casino that you've ever heard of. She was at the Last Frontier, then the Flamingo, then the Riviera. I feel like I'm forgetting one, but she was everywhere in Las Vegas. And I came across her doing Florida Girls because they make a stop in Vegas, and they go out and see Liberace because he was sort of discovered there. And his appearance really set the stage for the Las Vegas residency. And this was the mastermind of that. And do you know how hard this woman is to find information on? I could find almost nothing. I went to the UNLV library, and this wonderful librarian there helped me track down recordings of her and some other documents, original source material. And she was just very, very interesting. When that Bugsy Siegel movie came out, well, it was called Bugsy. It was the Warren Beatty movie. She's quoted as saying what a wonderful boss Bugsy Siegel had been, which is kind of interesting if you know anything about Bugsy Siegel. And she also said that when he died, she was at the Flamingo, and it was as if a cold air came through the room. So I thought she was interesting. She didn't make it until Vegas Girls, so she wasn't really a fit for Florida Girls, except for that I got the Liberace in there. And that's it. The Florida Girls, really, it's about the fact that the mafia in Florida is homegrown. And I think that's really interesting that we do our own thing here, no matter what.